All right, First Chronicles 2 and 3, since we actually have 8 chapters this week. Let's title them once again, Reconciliation, but subtitle them Distance, picking up on what we talked about in First Chronicles 1, where we said that God can use distance to produce reconciliation. We can see that in these 2 chapters, where chapter 2 is going to focus on David's genealogy, meaning the people who led up to David's birth. And chapter 3 is primarily going to focus on his descendants, not simply the kings of Judah, but beyond the kings of Judah, Zerubbabel, who God is going to use to help rebuild Jerusalem after Judah returns from exile. But first, the genealogy, those leading up to the birth of David. Like we said, not all of these names are going to be familiar, but 3 of the ones that stood out to me were, of course, David himself. And not just David, Caleb, somebody who was instrumental during the period of the Exodus and then settling the land of Israel. And then finally, probably a less familiar name, Rechab, who was the forefather of people who became known as the Rechabites. And the reason why David stood out is, of course, he's known as a man after God's own heart. Caleb, because of his trust, meaning no matter how big the people of the land of Canaan seemed, he trusted God enough to look backwards and say, wait a minute, if he's delivered us from Egypt, a nation that mighty, I'm completely convinced he can help us overcome these giants in the land of Canaan. So he trusted God in a way that was uncommon for the other 12 spies, understanding that the only other person who stood with him was Joshua. And then finally, Rechab, someone who the book of Jeremiah is going to go into detail and help us understand, is a picture of obedience, something that can be a 4-letter word for us in these times, but something that God is going to emphasize, and not just God, but John is going to emphasize. Even though, like David, it might be good to be people after God's own heart, the question in life is evidence. It's one thing to have a friend, but what is the evidence that you actually have someone you can rely on in a friend or somebody that you feel affectionately towards? And for God, the book of 1 John is going to say that our love for God is evidenced in our ability to accept his advice and grow beyond a point where we have to look at it just as advice. But to become comfortable accepting his commandments is not something that's offensive in an era where we prize our freedom, but accept his counsel to the point where obedience no longer seems like it's a 4-letter word. And so what we may be seeing in David's genealogy are those who are giving us an example of not only how much it means to have a heart for God, but to have a heart for the things he is telling us it's best for us to do. Likewise, how important it is for us to trust God, because as we've talked about all the way back in Genesis 2, it is hard to have a healthy relationship without trust. Why? Because you can't always be around your loved ones, and if you cannot trust them, it makes for a very miserable relationship, because it can be really difficult to always have to answer questions to reassure people in your family where you are, what you're doing, and what your intentions are. And likewise, it can be a very miserable existence to always worry about whether or not you can trust the people around you. And so love and trust are 2 things that this genealogy seems to emphasize are important to God in much the same way they're important to us in our relationships. But beyond that, David's descendants go through simply the kings of Israel that are carted off into captivity to Zerubbabel and beyond. Zerubbabel, as we've already mentioned, the man that God would use to help rebuild Jerusalem as Judah returned from captivity, helping us to understand this, that from the very beginning, God had a plan that the distance he would use in the form of exile was not an excuse to end his relationship with Israel, but it was simply a tool, much like we saw between Abram and Lot, who used distance. But when Lot got in trouble, Abram was right there to help him out. Likewise with Jacob and Esau, even though their relationship got to the point where Esau wanted to kill Jacob, the distance allowed them some time to cool down and actually come back to a point where they could have peace with one another, even if their descendants still had trouble getting along. And likewise, God used exile as a period of time that wasn't forever. It was simply an opportunity for him to open the door to reconciliation, understanding that in our lives, things like being unfriended, maybe on something like Facebook, or blocked, can seem final. But I began to have a different perspective on being unfriended and blocked when I began to have reconciliation personally with people who I remained blocked or unfriended from on social media, helping me to see this. The real relationship goes beyond social media, and even something like being blocked or unfriended can simply create a healthy amount of distance that can open the door to reconciliation. So as we often say, God's best to you as you go forward in him. God willing, allowing him to give us a fresh perspective on even things as hurtful as being blocked or unfriended. Not as so much being the end of a relationship, but God willing, potentially creating the kind of distance that can actually open the door to reconciliation.